lentil-shaped objects that they would encounter not far from the United States waters, actually, ascending and descending from the ocean. Lakes, deep water lakes in the Soviet Union, was one of the most interesting cases reported in 1982. 1982, I mentioned it before once or twice. It was one of those years where, at least in the Soviet Union and Eurasia, you had a lot of cases coming like waves of UFO and USO observations. Well, in 1982, in the Baikal deep water lake in the Soviet Union, during some tests, they discovered gigantic beings, gigantic 3 meters tall. What would it make? 9 feet, I take it, who were moving around, going around their business, not having any any equipment to help them breathe, dressed in some strange silvery uniforms or suits, call it whatever you want. Of course, Soviets became concerned. Who is it that's lurking in our waters without our permission? So they tried to capture 1 or 2 beings, and as a result, they lost a number of their frogmen, because these frogmen were pushed out from the water at incredible speed, and you can't do that. You have to go through stages. And whoever gave that order was not very smart, but the Soviets learned fast. And so one of their generals, Derenenko was his name, was sent immediately to the Issyk-Kul lake. This is a lake in Kyrgyzstan. Very interesting, very unusual body of water. I keep writing in Fate magazine about this because there are ancient legends, and one of them definitely pertains to what we know about these gigantic beings, because thousands of years ago, well, not thousands, but at least thousands of years ago, there was a so-called kingdom there, very unusual, that's finally went down to the bottom of the lake, and a cave was discovered, I would say, in the late 1920s, around that lake, that had skeletons of beings that were described just as the ones reported in 1982, and they were clad in silvery suits, had some very unusual materials around them, decorations. One was saved. The skeletons were destroyed by those who found them. But this is something that's factual and very interesting. In any event, Soviet commanders in the Issyk-Kul lake were warned not to touch any of the so-called swimmers, let them be. The person who brought up this story also had information about the orders given to the Soviet engineering land and inland forces about prevalence of USO cases all over bodies of Soviet water. What I want to say is that Russian seamen and sailors saw quite a lot, and not only them, and reported them. And Soviets decided not to play games, leave them alone. I had confirmation not that long ago from the same Setka program, because we do get documents once in a while. When I say we, I should say my colleagues and friends in the former Soviet Union, such as Vladimir Uvarov, Michael Gerstein, Nikolai Subbotin. I always like to give them their due, because these guys go on with the research no matter how hard it is for them, no matter how dangerous it is sometimes. So we do get information out. In 1982, one of the cases that was officially reported through this Setka military program was a so-called crashed something. They didn't want to say UFO, but an object crashed in a forest in Russia, and 2 sergeants reported what they saw, a being 9 feet tall, dressed in silvery suits, running away from them. And the more details they gave, nobody put it together with this case, but because of 1982, I think there is a definite coincidence. I also had some other reports from Russia of similar beings that were sighted in the lakes, again, in the areas where you have a lot of UFO cases. For example, North Russia, around St. Petersburg, Leningrad before, and a few other areas. So as you go through Russian cases and Ukrainian cases, you start seeing certain areas. And during the years that I've studied UFOs, I kind of made a map for myself to see what's going on. And you see it's Central Asia, Iranian border, the so-called Pamir Mountains that stretch through Central Asia, North Russia, Black Sea, some areas in Central Russia. And then when Mr. Plaksin, whom I mentioned, the scientist who was involved in that program, when he came out with his reports, you see, apparently the Setka program made their own map of Soviet UFO sightings. And I gotta tell you that, you know, we were very close. Because you can't, no matter how much you try, you cannot silence people. You can do as much as you can, but you can't. So there are different ways. Either you lie and pretend UFOs don't exist, or they're swamp gas, or you know, and go to devious ways. Well, I think this is what's happening in the United States. Or you lie, as in the Soviet Union, they try to lie, but at the same time they had to admit UFOs existed and were interfering with their military tests. And you had to say, well, this strange aerial anomalous phenomena may not be UFOs, but has to be studied. Or you do like they do in China, openly, with the help of the government, get to it, get the best and the brightest, as they do with other things, and get to the bottom of the problem. And I think they may be ahead of us, just like we have this case with them and the Russians going to Phobos. Phobos, I need to touch on that, is a moonlet of Mars, so is Deimos. Hundreds of years ago, and maybe thousands of years ago, humans knew that they were of artificial origin. Then came the Middle Ages, Dark Ages, and people were forced to forget. Until 1876, when an American astronomer discovered them, nobody basically knew about them except for Jonathan Swift, who described them in his novel very, very closely. So this knowledge existed, and I guess this knowledge exists in the archives of top government agencies that study such information, because in 1989, a joint European, Soviet, and American program called Phobos, there was another name in Russian for the official name, but basically Soviets and others created two spaceships that were sent to study Mars, and specifically Phobos, that had laser weapons on board, and we still don't know how powerful. I mean, I gave as much information as I could find, and enough was found. Enough maybe to alarm anyone who exists in that area, maybe a sentient human being, sentient intelligent being, not human, who would not want laser weapons fired at its grounds, its planet. So one of the Phobos space probes was lost on the way to Mars. The other one made it to the orbit, was studying Phobos, was about to do its experiments, trying to prick Phobos soil, and also sent its so-called hoppers, an equipment to ride around and hop around the planet and collect soil samples. Anyway, on March 28, 1989, something spinned that space probe out of the orbit, spinned it very hard. And that something happened to be an object, a lentil-shaped object of 25 kilometers more or less in size, that was photographed by Phobos, and photograph was sent to Earth. So Globkosmos, Soviet space agency, had it. Americans, of course, knew about it, because JPL apparently received information daily, if not more often. So did the other powers that were interested in the Phobos program. I read tons of Soviet newspapers from the period. We were able to purchase it back, I think, about in 1990. They don't sell that material anymore. It doesn't, they keep it shut down. But when I read interviews with Soviet officials, I couldn't believe it. They kept saying, and you could see it, that there was a swarm of small bodies around the Phobos space probe when it was destroyed, that they mentioned this, kept mentioning this very strange object, huge object, next, seen next to Phobos before it was destroyed. Some of the top Soviet scientists kept saying, well, maybe it were the aliens that pulled the object away, semi-jokingly, but who knows? And there was much more. And I am very proud, because this is not going to happen anymore. Russia is a different country now. That was a brief period of openness and so-called glasnost and democracy coming to Russia. Perestroika and so forth. Well, because of that, we found out a lot. A lot of information leaked out to the West. And not all, as you can see in the documents I sent you, there is a letter that states that there are no documents pertaining to the Roswell case exist. Well, what happened to the ones Stalin had? Who keeps them? Of course they have them. We can't prove it. We can't prove, we don't know what's going on with the naval files, but we do know because of people like Vladimir Azhaja, who is today 76, 77 years old, and may he have a long life. Because of people like him, we find out a lot. He had good friends. He was a former submarine officer himself, and he had good friends in the Soviet naval intelligence who protected him when the Communist Party made sure he was fired from his job for wanting to find out too much about UFOs and forbidden lectures that he gave out. So they protected him. They took him in, and the first assignment they gave to Vladimir Azhaja in 1976 was to write a monograph about USOs. So you had bright, intelligent people in the armed forces who did not want, who had to play the game, but at the same time they wanted to find out what's going on. And because of that, Vladimir Azhaja, because of his good relationship with top naval officials, we found out a lot. And later he became one of the fathers of Soviet ufology, actually, in the later years, and still persists. But we found out about reports coming from about UFOs. For example, the 9 discs, I believe, from 1977 that came to a secret Soviet naval base and buzzed around and did whatever they wanted. We also found out about submarine encounters, and he mentioned a few other cases. And other people came out, and we found out about Soviet submarines that were involved in the so-called croaker research. Now, croaking sound is something that frogs make. From 1975 to about 1980, Soviet submarines in the Atlantic, mostly in the waters around the Atlantic, of course they like to come to this area, they were engaged by very enigmatic, gigantic beings deep underwater who tried to communicate with them. That's what they thought. And reacted to Soviet signals, from the submarines. Of course, Soviets were nervous. They thought it was an American invention, something, but it was not. It was a very strange case because it stopped about 1980. Again, 75, 1980. In other research, I found out there were a lot of cases underwater, in the sky, and on land that pertain to USOs and UFOs. No one knows until now what happened, because suddenly in 1980, everything was shut down. I'm sorry, from I would say 1982 to 1984. This research was shut down. Submarine naval commanders were sent to other institutions, other sites, other bases, and some people are trying to find out what's going on. At the time, they thought it was the Americans. They thought maybe some gigantic unknown animals, but more and more, the more information comes out, and there is not a lot, the more people are convinced, knowledgeable people, that we're dealing with something that's not human, not of human origin. Again, this was just one of the cases. There were more.
I had long assumed that the legend of Men in Black was just part of American UFO mythology. Once you have been told worryingly similar stories from a growing band of seemingly reliable witnesses, however, you do have to reassess the situation. These people were not in contact with one another. Most had no knowledge of the American legends, and the cases were scattered across the UK over 30 or 40 years. I soon came to realize that something was going on here, and I had a responsibility to take note of what these people said. She goes on to say, I discovered that most people had taken the view that there was no serious evidence to be investigated, and so chose to pretend that the problem did not exist. I cannot have that luxury. The problem does exist, and I was finding more and more examples as my work continued. The patterns that link the cases together were becoming obvious. I had to delve into this difficult area and set out for the first time the full story of the Men in Black. Okay. That they are part of the phenomenon itself, some sort of shape-changing alien manifestation, may well seem rather absurd to you. Frankly, it sits uncomfortably with me, although the UFO world is full of surprises and I rule nothing out. This is an idea proposed by some researchers and has at least traces of tantalizing evidence in support. Honesty dictates that I must take an impartial look. The other option, and the one that I suspect most readers will find easier to accept, is that the MIB are the product of a covert operation on the fringes of government study into UFOs. Even if this turns out to be the truth, it still poses huge questions. And you got to hand it to her there. I mean, if the Man in Black phenomenon is aliens trying to pretend to be G-men to harass you, to silence you, that is so strange that it's really weird. It's weirder than UFOs. But if the government is acting strange and training people to act really weird and off-kilter, to really throw people off balance, don't even act like a normal, G-man, act really strange. I can't fathom neither one makes sense to me, so I don't know what the heck is going on. So I just tell you, I don't know what's going on. There's one more quote in here, but I can't find it. My stickies lost their stickiness and they're rolling around, so I don't want to hold you up here. But this is a great book, and it opened me up to researching a lot of these old cases. Okay. One of the old cases that she has in here was one of my favorites from my childhood, the Templeton case. This is a picture that was reproduced in plenty of books about UFOs when I was growing up. But of course, back then, we're talking about cost analysis here. It was always a grainy black and white photo, and I could never really see what the big fuss was about. But now that we have the internet, we can put fairly big files of color photos. You can actually see what the fuss is about. You can see above this little girl posing with the little posies or whatever, right above her head, there seems to be this suspended robot or suspended spaceman or whatever you want to call it with a visor over his face. And it's pretty freaky. Here's a little closer view of it, and it's really pretty clear. This is the Jim Templeton case. And I'm not really familiar with Britain, so they use a lot of different descriptions when it comes to, I'll make this a little bigger, let's see. They use a lot of different descriptions to describe the geographic area, so feel free to jump in if you can clarify. But this happened in the Cumbria area, May 24th, 1964. And this guy, Jim Templeton, he was with the fire brigade. He was a fireman. And he was the official photographer for the firemen. 1964, we're talking. And he just happened to take a picnic with his wife and 2 daughters out near a marshy area on a beautiful day. And this marshy area is very interesting. There's kind of featureless, as you can see by this picture. And maybe I'll take it back to this other picture. There's no trees, it's just a marshland. On one end, there is a Blue Streak missile factory. The missiles are not launched there, they're made there. And oddly enough, because the British Empire goes everywhere, they are launched in Woomera, Australia. So 10,000 miles away. But that's the situation. They are constructed there. On the other end of this marsh, there's a nuclear power plant. So it's kind of an interesting area in that regard. But he goes down and has the picnic. He takes 3 little pictures of his daughter. The first one and the third one came out all right. This is how this one came out. And to use a colloquialism, he drops the pictures off at the local, I guess, equivalent of a drugstore where they have a chemist. The chemist sent them to Kodak, which was the thing to do in 1964. The chemist said, "Too bad that man in the spacesuit ruined the best picture." He was like, "What?" You know, he didn't know what was going on. But he took the pictures and he didn't even respond because he thought, that was from left field, what do I say? He went home and he started looking at his pictures and he went, "That is really strange." So he went to the police and said, "Can you help me unravel this?" The police scratched their head. They said, "Well, we don't really have the methodology to look into a photograph." I mean, so they contacted Kodak. So Kodak formally got involved. And because Kodak got involved, it was a local news story, and the picture got printed in the local newspaper, and pretty soon the government comes to call. And the government men dropped by, and they said, it's probably better off if you drop it. We're looking into it, and we're working with Kodak on it, but you should try to lay low on this. So he respected that from the government. He was patriotic, and he just wanted to give them their space to handle this, whatever the case may be. Then some time went on, I think a couple of months. But then he had two other visitors that showed up. And he said, "Can I ask you where you're from?" And they said, "No, you can't. We are Her Majesty's government." That was the reply. And they asked Jim to show them the site where he took the photographs. So they drove him to the site in their fancy new Jaguar. And on arriving, they began to grill him about all these different elements. Like, they said to him, "What were the animals doing? Tell us all about the animals. We really want to know details about the animals." "Well, what about the birds? What were the birds doing?" "No, really, do you remember the birds?" And he keeps wondering, "I really don't remember that much. It is true that there are some sheep and some whatever out there, and they were acting a little strange, like a storm was about to come, the way they huddled together, but I can't really put my finger on anything too strange." Well, oddly enough, it was determined from another source that at that time, right around that time, a whole bunch of these homing pigeons had been released in a big competition, and all of them went off their path, like none of them were recovered. They all went into the great beyond. And homing pigeons, it is thought now, though it keeps being refined, but they think they use magnetics to get around, because even on totally overcast days, they can navigate just fine. So magnetic anomaly might have been in place here. So maybe that's why he was grilling them about the animals and the birds and so forth. But Jim Templeton had no idea what he was talking about. Anyway, Kodak comes back with a report saying it looks like a real thing in real space. The only thing odd is if you extended his legs, he's not on the ground, he's floating, but it's completely modeled in a three-dimensional way. It's not two shots, double exposure. We can't see any trickery. It looks like there really was a spaceman. Whatever that means. Well, later Templeton went out to take slides of the marsh because, he's kind of local celebrity now, and the fire brigade says, why don't we get the fire hall together, we'll charge something at the door to help the fire brigade, and you can do your little story and maybe show some slides of the marsh and explain how this all happened. So he's like, oh, that's cool. So he goes down to the marsh. Remember, 1964, we don't have electronic media, so he's got to shoot slides now if he wants to have a talkie show. So he goes and shoots the slides, and then he drops them off at the chemist like he's always done, what he calls a chemist. And the slides came back, but everything in the roll that had the marsh was gone. And the chemist threw her hand, she goes, "I'm sorry, but we're working with the government," and they took them. And he's like, what is going on? So he delves into that a little bit, and so does, he knew a little bit of the story, but then Jenny Randalls delves into it and tries to find the paper trail, and this will freak you out. But remember, those Blue Streak missiles are made there, but they're launched 10,000 miles away in Woomera, Australia. There was a day, that same day that he was taking pictures in Woomera, what happened was they were about to launch a Blue Streak missile test, and they looked on these monitors that had the entire area, the launch area, and they saw two men in spacesuits wandering around. Not something you want when you're about to launch a missile and you have unauthorized people roaming around. So the launch was scrubbed for the day, and apparently they kept playing back the video trying to figure it out. And it was one of the weirder things to have happen. And then when they see through channels, other people in UK, the picture of this, the same exact time frame where the missiles are made, there's this interdimensional, God only knows what, being showing up in a picture. It really threw the government for a loop. I mean, you can think time travel, you know, your mind really wanders, but that was a very weird incident. And when the guys picked, this is the Man in Black part, when the two visitors arrived at the fire, they actually arrived at the fire station. First they dropped in on the wife and talked to her, but eventually they went to the fire station. They took him to the site, and they said, you know, what about the animals, what about the birds, what about this, what about that? And they really grilled him like he had important information. But then it's the turnaround, it's the old takeaway. Then they said, this is all a hoax, this is ridiculous, you're hoaxing us. Where was the man standing? He goes, man standing, I never saw a man. Oh, come on, oh, come on. So, and that's the pattern that frequently occurs too. It's the bad guy, you know, nice guy, draw everything out of you and then criticize you and leave you hanging. And they really left him hanging because they had driven him out there and then they just sped off in their Jaguar, leaving him flabbergasted. So he had equivalent of about a 5-mile walk home. I'm going to get some water. I just got to get a quick sip here. That's another thing that happens with Men in Black sightings. That's not the only case. I have 2 other cases I've been able to find in the literature where the Man in Black takes you to a site where you saw something or does something wacko, and they leave you there. One guy was at work. The visitors came to his work, and they said, we're really interested in the shoes you were wearing during the sighting, whatever that means. So they took him home, and they kept studying all his shoes in the closet. They said, I think we have what we need. And they left him there, and he's like, wait a minute, I'm at home, my car's at work. You know, once again, so they do strand people. That's another bizarre harassment technique, I guess. The latest, talk about the CODA, that seems to be coming up. The latest addendum on this Jim Templeton case was something I saw on the internet. This was also known as the Solway Spaceman, because it was called the Solway Firth. It was another nickname for the area. The Solway Spaceman incident of 1964. In 2004, they had a 40-year anniversary. And this guy put this on the net. He says, as part of the forthcoming Fred Festival, I don't know what Fred is, it's all caps, on the 10th of October, I have been asked to recreate the famous Templeton photo taken in 1964 by the fireman Jim Templeton. The picture of his daughter was ruined by the apparition of a space-suited figure in the background. I'm trying to figure out more about the incident. Was it a hoax? Was it a trick? Let me know your views and thoughts on the best way to restage the photograph. That sounds like an interesting project there. Okay. I do have one more, let's see. This is just an article that ran in 2002, I guess. Just recanting it, and I mean recounting and not recanting, recounting the story. And someone had a question, has it ever been established what was going on there with that Solway Spaceman? And, you know, the guy, Jim Templeton, so many years later, stands by his story, stands by the suggestion that there had something, the government was very nervous about it because of this, this connection with the missile range down in Australia. Here's another weird one, the Rex Heflin story. And I love reading about these stories that we all know the basic storyline, but we didn't know that there was a Man in Black aspect to it. But these are the Heflin photos, which you've seen probably many times. I thought I had more of them in here, but... Okay. Well, this is emblematic of the Heflin photo. Rex Heflin, August 3rd, 1965. He's a highway traffic inspector in Santa Ana, California. He snapped a total of 4 shots with his Polaroid camera, and he had the camera with him because that was part of his official duties to see if there was like a sign down or some kind of damage to the roadway that he was supposed to document for future work. So he's inspecting and he's got his camera. And all of a sudden this craft comes up, and there's a series of photographs. I should have them all in here. Sorry, I don't. Anyway, he takes these pictures. And remember, they're Polaroids, so there's no such thing as a negative. It's all in one. But the Marines from the local El Toro base approached him to study the photos when word got out that he got the pictures. He gave them to the Marines, and they returned them promptly in like 2 weeks. So he was very happy about that. And they said, we're shaking our head, we're not really sure what they are.